The city of Milan certainly has an incredibly long history. It first appears in the ancient record in around 590 BCE as a Celtic settlement, later conquered by the Romans. And when Emperor Diocletian divided the Roman Empire, Milan was the capital of the western half. But here in the 21st century, it's perhaps better known as a fashion capital, indeed it's home to Prada. Or perhaps you know it as the home of AC and Inter Milan, the football clubs. Yet, as we've seen with these European cities, ancient settlements often produce a range of ghosts and legends, and it's unsurprising, with so many people living out their lives in close proximity across such a span of time. Milan's folkloric side includes traditional cuisine, dragons, ghostly women in black veils, and even a column defaced by the devil, among other things. Let's find out more in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are wrapping up this particular instalment of European cities and their folklore, although we will no doubt come back to it at some point in the future. But we are finishing up with Milan, which I visited in 2016, and I really liked the city. And also when I started looking into its legends and folklore, I was like, it has some really cool stories, hence the reason why we're having a look at it. And before I forget, this episode is brought to you by Purple Columbine, which meant resolve to win in the Victorian language of flowers. And I picked that because I actually came across them the other day and it's a really pretty flower. But anyway, let's jump into Milan's folklore. And we're going to start off with the Duomo, which is one of the places to see in Milan. It's absolutely huge. Like, it's really quite impressive just on the size of scale. But it's just also a really cool place to visit. It originally set the astronomical reference for the prime meridian before Greenwich took over in 1884, and the Duomo features a sundial from 1780, and sunlight passes through an oculus to then hit this sundial. When the sundial showed midday, the church would ring its bells so everyone could then set their clocks to midday. And I just thought that was quite cool. Aristocrat Gian Galeazzo Visconti actually ordered the construction of the Duomo. Yet the reason for its construction is, if you believe the story, a little bit less than holy, because according to legend, the devil appeared in one of Visconti's dreams in 1386. Satan ordered him to build a church, and not just any church. Diabolical images would decorate the church, or the devil would take his soul. And this explains the sheer number of monstrous heads on the Duomo's exterior. And as it is, the Duomo actually has over 3,400 statues, making it the building with the highest number of statues in the world. Now, they're not all diabolical at all, but it's still an impressive achievement. Now, the main spire also boasts a gilded copper statue called the Madonnina, and people actually worried that she might attract lightning when she was installed in 1774. As far as I'm aware, she hasn't actually done that. And the locals covered her with rags during the Second World War so bombers wouldn't spot any light bouncing off her seemingly golden surface, and a rather solemn ceremony accompanied her unveiling in May 1945. Now, inside, the Duomo actually boasts a particularly gruesome statue of St. Bartholomew, who wears his flayed skin draped around his shoulders like a somewhat fetching wrap. He looks quite proud of himself as well. It's a very strange statue, and apparently it once stood outside the Duomo, but people found it way too unsettling, so the priests moved it inside instead. Now, Bartholomew, I had to look up who he was, and he was one of the 12 apostles in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke. He's sometimes identified with Nathaniel. Not a lot is actually known about him beyond the fact that he was one of the apostles, other than the fact he preached in both India and Armenia and was apparently flayed alive, hence the way that he's then depicted in art. Now, at one point, one of his churches was actually built on the site of a temple of Asclepius, and obviously there is an episode on Asclepius if you're interested in who he is. So over time, Bartholomew then has accrued a bit of an association with medicine as well. And this is quite cool because the statue in the Duomo by Marco the Great from 1562 ends up being like weirdly ironic as a teaching aid because it's so anatomically detailed with all the muscles, veins and tendons visible that it kind of becomes a bit of a teaching aid for the body's underlying structure. It is very weird, and I've put a photo of that in the blog post and also in the YouTube video just at this point so you can see what it looks like. And that's one of the photos I took, so I wanted to put it in there. And going from one extreme to the other, the Duomo is also linked with a traditional Milanese dish, and according to legend, risotto alla Milanese, which is famously bright yellow because it's dyed with saffron, came from the Duomo site. So in 1574, Valerio di Fiandra was a master glassmaker working on the Duomo, and he was working on a window that depicted St. Helena. Now, one of his assistants gained the nickname Zafferano because he kept mixing saffron into the glass to achieve that really startling yellow colour. At the same time, preparations were in full swing for Valerio's daughter's wedding, and as the story goes, they served bright yellow risotto at the banquet after Zafferano added saffron as a joke to the risotto. Luckily, the guests loved it, and it then went on to become a staple in Milanese cuisine. Now, is the story true? Well, there's really no way to tell, but it is quite a sweet story in a lot of ways, and I quite like the fact that it inextricably links the Duomo with one of Milan's most famous dishes. Now, from one church to another, we all know that I love a good ossuary here on Fabulous Folklore, and Milan is no exception. And I'm kicking myself that I didn't know about this before I went, because otherwise I would absolutely have gone to have seen it. Now, this ossuary's origins actually lie in 1210, when one of the cemeteries ran out of room. And this, of course, is a problem that you have when a city expands and there's nowhere else to put the dead. So officials then built a room to hold the bones, and then eventually added a church in 1269 as well. Giovanni Andrea Biffi restored the church in 1679, using skulls and tibia to decorate the ossuary walls. And this is something that we also see in other ossuaries around the world as well, where somebody then decides to actually use the bones as some kind of artistic decoration. Now, fire destroyed the church in 1712, leading to the construction of a new church, this one dedicated to San Bernardino of Siena. And this new church actually included plans for a much bigger ossuary because it had proved to be such a draw for visitors. And it's likely that the bones are those of patients from the nearby Ospedale del Brolo hospital and the monks who ran it. Now, there is a bit of a fragment of a ghost story attached, in that the ghost of a young girl apparently appears here on the anniversary of her death, and I'm not sure if this is the same little girl as the one whose bones apparently come back to life every 2nd of November, which is All Souls Day, to lead the other skeletons in a dance macabre. I don't know if that's the same person or not. And this is one of the problems that I found with ghosts in terms of Milan stories. You get like a little snippet, but then there's not much more beyond that. So I wanted to include the ossuary just because obviously ossuaries are quite interesting places, and there are these fragments of stories attached, but there's not a huge amount of information that I was able to find beyond that. So if you know any more about that, please do feel free to let me know. And we're going to move on to witches now. And if you head to the Piazza Vetra, you'll find a park beside the Basilica of San Lorenzo that marks the execution site of Milan's witches and heretics. So Parina de Bugatis and Sibilla Zani were accused of witchcraft in 1390, marking the start of a wave of witchcraft trials. Other executions actually continued here until the deaths of Maria Palmoglia and Margherita Martiniana in 1641. Now, the tribunal of the Inquisition actually took place at Santo Stogio nearby, and the condemned were taken from the tribunal to the execution site, where they were then burned alive. And to do so, they crossed a wooden bridge over the Vetra River that ran through the square. Apparently it now runs under the square. And according to legend, this was known as the Bridge of Sighs. So if you want to go and pay your respects to those people who lost their lives as a result of witch trials and inquisitions, then I would head to the Piazza Vetra. We also have the Visconti family, who ruled Milan in the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, and they're related to Sforza Castle. Now, their emblem shows a serpent with the head of a dog eating a boy, and it actually remained the emblem for Sforza Castle even after the Visconti family lost their prominence. And yes, if you're familiar with the history of the tarot, you'll recognise Visconti Sforza as one of the names of one of the medieval decks. Now, this particular deck was made sometime after 1450, and it may have been commissioned for Francesco Sforza, who married Filippo Maria Visconti's only child. Now, at this point, the deck was used to play a trump game, and the rules sound a little bit complicated, I'm not going to lie. And while the cards used in fortune telling only really appears in the 19th century, many of the figures from these medieval decks do survive in contemporary tarot decks. So you do have the likes of the Queen of Swords and other figures like that. The High Priestess originally was the Popess and things like that, but they are really interesting to look at them just from an artistic point of view. But it was quite fascinating to find that link to Milan with tarot and so on through the Visconti Sforza deck. But back to the Visconti family. According to legend, a dragon came to Milan and feasted on its women and children, and it was Uberto Visconti that slew the dragon and thus took over the city. I can't help thinking that that was probably a little bit more likely a story that was told to kind of justify how they came to power, but there we go. There's also a legend of a dragon named Tarantasio in Lake Garundo that appears in Lombardy's folklore, Lombardy being the area of Italy where Milan is. Now, the lake no longer exists, but at the time it seems that Tarantasio actually crawled out of the lake to eat children and animals, and it also spread disease across the countryside. One day, Tarantasio crawled out of the lake, ready to demand its next meal. Only this time, it didn't face children or livestock. Instead, a great hero stood waiting, brandishing a mighty sword. The hero slew the dragon, ending its reign of terror. Some people say this hero was Frederick Barbarossa, who you might remember from the King in the Mountain episode. Others think it was St. Christopher, or in later centuries people said it was one of the Visconti family. So it's one of those kind of things where if you've got a legend of some kind of bravery or daring do, it's quite good if you can get your name associated with it. But as you can imagine, Sforza Castle features several ghosts. One of them is Ludovico Maria Sforza, who apparently spends his eternity running away from the French. Now, it's quite odd that he would appear at the castle since the French did capture him in 1500 and he died in France in 1508. So it's a little bit odd that he would still appear at the castle, but there we go. The headless Bianca Scapodone Visconti stalks the corridors, and the screams of Beatrice d'Este, which was actually Ludovico's wife, continue to echo after she died in childbirth, aged just 21, giving birth to her third child. But the one that really fascinates me is La Dama Velata, or the Veiled Lady, who wanders in the Sempione Park behind the castle. No one knows who she is or indeed how long she's been there, but those who meet her describe a woman dressed in black and wearing a black veil across her face, and she seems desperate to find someone. And there's this allure about her where those who encounter her all feel compelled to help her. She'll take their hand and lead them to an old house in the park, and nobody knows where this house is or which one it is. Nobody ever seems to be able to find it again after they've been there, but at some point once they get back to the house, she lifts up a veil which hides an empty skull. In some of the stories, this then drives the person who helped her mad. Other people then just feel compelled to then come back and help her, and then that's when they can't find the house and so on. In some versions of the story, the smell of violets accompanies sightings, which is quite cool. Other times she tends to appear when it's foggy, and then also she disappears for weeks at a time if anybody upsets her. Now, there's also a marble column to the left of the Basilica di San Brogio in the Piazza San Ambrogio, dating to the 2nd century, and it stands on its own, which is kind of already a bit weird, but it's most notable for 2 deep holes in it. And according to legend, Satan made them. And you know how I love stories where Satan's involved with stuff and the making of things or the changing of things. And yes, Milan's got one of these stories as well. So St. Ambrose was walking in the church grounds when the devil appeared. Now, the saint just wanted peace and quiet for his contemplations, but the devil isn't exactly famous for silent meditation. So while St. Ambrose is just walking along, trying to contemplate, the devil's just tormenting him. And I don't know why, but I get a mental image of like Bart Simpson picking on Lisa Simpson at this point. And Ambrose put up with it for as long as he possibly could, but eventually he's just like, do you know, I've said shush and you haven't, and he gave him an almighty kick. So almighty, in fact, that he actually kicked the devil right at this marble column, and his horns actually stuck into the marble, holding the devil fast until the following day. When he disappeared, locals believed that he had actually returned to hell via the holes. The legend also claims that the holes still lead to the underworld, and if you get close, you can actually smell sort of sulphur, which is believed to come from one of Hades' rivers. And some even say that you can see Satan driving a coach of the damned on the night before Easter Sunday. Somebody really needs to check that and see if that does actually happen. Because like a lot of these folkloric things, that's testable. But never mind. It wouldn't be a folklore of a city post without a haunted theatre. And La Teatro alla Scala is probably one of the world's most famous theatres. So I kind of had to put it in here anyway. And Maria Theresa of Austria ordered La Scala's construction, and it opened in August 1778. And architects actually later modelled the Vienna Opera on this theatre. La Scala's name actually means staircase because the theatre stands on the site of Santa Maria della Scala, and that's essentially the Church of the Holy Mary of the Staircase. And this church got its name because a mother put a statue of Mary on a staircase landing, and then her sick child got better, which is quite cool. And it's quite nice to have someone actually getting better in one of these stories. But that's where La Scala got its name from. In terms of ghost stories, it was really upsetting because apparently there's 2 really famous singers who've been seen at La Scala, but I couldn't find out much more beyond them. So in one of them, it's the ghost of 19th century soprano Maria Malibran, who apparently appears at the theatre, and she actually died after a horse riding accident aged 28. So she apparently still appears at the Scala, and I couldn't find much more about her other than that. And Maria Callas, of all people, apparently also appears on stage at the Scala from time to time. And even though she was Greek-American, apparently she loved Milan so much that she didn't want to leave. I couldn't find much else beyond them, so if anybody else knows anything additional about these ghosts at the Scala, again, please do feel free to let me know. You can drop a comment below if you want, or you can obviously leave one on YouTube or on the blog post or whatever. Just I think that some of these stories are so interesting, it's kind of frustrating that there's only a fragment attached to them. And I just wanted to leave you with one final snippet of folklore attached to Milan, and that is if you head to the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, which is basically opposite the Duomo, so you can't really miss it. If you go in there, you'll find a floor mosaic of a prancing bull, and there's a dent right where the bull's testicles are. And according to the legend, if you put your right heel in that dent and then spin around 3 times without falling over, it'll bring you luck, or it might grant a wish, or it might also guarantee a return to Milan. It depends. I also heard from somebody else that it's supposed to also bring you luck in conception and fertility and stuff as well. So I don't know if it just depends on who's telling the story as to what it's good for. I just thought it was cool that there was quite an interesting little good luck association with Milan as well. And normally I always have all these death and destruction tales in these episodes, and this one's not been too bad for that. But I thought, yeah, we'll have a little good luck ritual at the end of it. So what exactly do we make of these Milan legends? Well, one thing that I think struck me when I was looking for these was the span of topics that you find in these legends, which are stretching from witch trials to the devil. You've got ghosts of famous people from history, you've got mysterious veiled women, and you've even got the origin of a traditional dish as well. And I think such stories become part of the tapestry of a city's culture. And the tales involving the Visconti family are especially noteworthy given their importance to the city's rise in power. Now, as always, it's impossible to tell exactly how many ordinary people would have told these stories, and indeed there is often a worry that such stories are only created for the tourists. Yet in Milan's case, so many of them are associated with specific locations that they do give you an excuse to wander, to find satanic columns, or marvel at a cathedral stained glass. So even if the stories are only for the tourists, then these stories will still give you a slightly different experience of the city. So if you find yourself in Milan, and I do highly recommend it as a destination, use these sites as a starting point, and who knows what else you'll encounter while you're there. So I'd love to know what you thought of these stories. Have you been to Milan? I'm really annoyed, like I said earlier in the episode, that a lot of these I didn't know about when I went. So I kind of went to the Duomo, had a look at the Galleria, saw La Scala, and then more or less had a bit of a wander, and then essentially had to go back to the hotel with a bit of heat stroke. But I didn't really get the chance to say much more beyond that, and I kind of wish that I'd known about these, because I would have gone and taken photos of them, and I certainly would have gone looking for the veiled woman in the park, because that's the kind of thing that I do. So anyway, I am actually going to Prague in July, so I will absolutely be on the hunt for cool folkloric things before I go, because it's Prague, you kind of can't move without falling over things like that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. And as I said in the last episode, if you are in Newcastle on the 8th of June at 6 p.m, I am doing a talk at the castle, which technically it's held at the Black Gate, but you know what I mean, about midsummer folklore. So we are going to be having a look at how people celebrated the summer solstice way back when we're talking about the ancients, and that really loose, vague phrase like that. We'll be having a look at how people celebrated Midsummer's Day in particular, mostly in the British Isles, sort of from like the 14th century onwards. And then we'll also be having a look at plants associated with midsummer, love magic and divination and things that you can do yourself, and basically digging into all things midsummer. So if you are in the area, it would be lovely to see you. Other than that, I do hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.